Section 18 of Great Pirate Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Patrick McAfee. Great Pirate Stories by Various. Edited by Joseph Louis French. Section 18. The Passing of Mogul Mackenzie, the Last of the North Atlantic Pirates, by Arthur Hunt Shute. In the farther end of the Bay of Fundy, about a mile off from the Nova Scotian coast, is the Isle of Haut. It is a strange rocky island that rises several hundred feet sheer out of the sea, without any bay or inlets. A landing can only be effected there in the calmest weather, and on account of the tremendous ebb of the Fundy tides, which rise and fall 60 feet every 12 hours, the venturesome explorer cannot long keep his boat moored against the precipitous cliffs. Because of this inaccessibility, little is known of the solitary island. Within its rampart walls of rock they say there is a green valley, and in its center is a fathomless lake, where the Micmac Indians used to bury their dead, and hence its dread appellation of the Island of the Dead. Beyond these bare facts nothing more is certain about the secret valley and the haunted lake. Many wild and fabulous descriptions are current, but they are merely the weavings of fancy. Sometimes on a stormy night the unhappy navigators of the North Channel miss the coast lights in the fog, and out from the Isle of Haut a gentle undertow flirts with their bewildered craft. Then, little by little, they are gathered into a mighty current against which all striving is in vain, and in the white foam among the iron cliffs their ship is pounded into splinters. The quarry which he gathers in so softly at first, and so fiercely at last, however, is soon snatched away from the siren shore. The ebb tide bears every sign of wreckage far out into the deeps of the Atlantic, and not a trace remains of the ill-starred vessel or her crew. But one of the boats in the fishing fleet never comes home, and from lonely huts on the coast reproachful eyes are cast upon the Island of the Dead. On the long winter nights, when the boys gather about the fire in Old Steele's general stores at Hall's Harbor, their hard gray life becomes bright for a spell. When a keg of hard cider is flowing freely, the grim fishermen forget their taciturnity. The ice is melted from their speech, and the floodgates of their souls pour forth. But ever in the background of their talk, unforgotten, like a haunting shadow, is the Island of the Dead. Of their weirdest and most blood-curdling yarns it is always the center. And when at last, with uncertain steps, they leave the empty keg and the dying fire to turn homeward, through the drifting snow, fearful and furtive glances are cast to where the island looms up like a ghostly sentinel from the sea. Across its high promontory the northern lights scintillate and blaze, and out of its moving brightness the terrified fishermen behold the war canoes of dead Indians, freighted with their red-skinned braves, the forms of coeurs de bois and desperate Frenchmen swinging down the skyline in a ghastly snake dance, the shapes and spars of ships long since forgotten from the missing list, and always, most dread-inspiring of them all, the distress signals from the sinking ship of Mogul Mackenzie and his pirate crew. Captain Mogul Mackenzie was the last of the pirates to scourge the North Atlantic seaboard. He came from that school of freebooters that was let loose by the American Civil War. With a letter of marque from the Confederate States, he sailed the seas to prey on Yankee shipping. He and his fellow privateers were so thorough in their work of destruction that the mercantile marine of the United States was ruined for a generation to come. When the war was over, the defeated South called off her few remaining bloodhounds on the sea. But Mackenzie, who was still at large, had drunk too deeply of the wine of a wild, free life. He did not return to lay down his arms, but began on a course of shameless piracy. He lived only a few months under the black flag, until he went down on the Isle of Haut. The events of that brief and thrilling period are unfortunately obscure, with only a ray of light here and there, but the story of his passing is the most weird of all the strange yarns that are spun about the Island of the Dead. In May 1865, a gruesome discovery was made off the coast of Maine, which sent a chill of fear through all the seaport towns of New England. A whaler bound for New Bedford was coming up Cape Cod one night long after dark. There was no fog, and the lights of approaching vessels could easily be discerned. The man on the lookout felt no uneasiness at his post when, without any warning of bells or lights, the sharp bow of a brigantine suddenly loomed up, hardly a ship's length in front. "What the blazes are you trying to do?" roared the mate from the bridge, enraged at this unheard-of violation of the right-of-way. But no voice answered his challenge, and the brigantine went swinging by, with all her sails set to a spanking breeze. She bore directly across the bow of the whaler, which just grazed her stern in passing. "There's something rotten on board there," said the mate. "Aye," said the captain, who had come on the bridge, "there's something rotten there, right enough. Swing your helm to port, and get after the devils," he ordered. "Aye, aye, sir," came the ready response, and nothing lost, the helmsman changed his course to follow the eccentric craft. She was evidently bound on some secret mission, for not otherwise would she thus tear through the darkness, before the wind, without the flicker of a light. The whaler was the swifter of the two ships, and she could soon have overhauled the other, but fearing some treachery, the captain refrained from running her down until daylight. All night long she seemed to be veering her course, attempting to escape from her pursuer. In the morning, off the coast of Maine, she turned her nose directly out to sea. Then a boat was lowered from the whaler and rowed out to intercept the oncoming vessel. When they were directly in her course, they lay on their oars and waited. The brigantine did not veer again, but came steadily on, and soon the whalemen were alongside, and made themselves fast to a dinghy which she had in tow. A few minutes of apprehensive waiting followed, and as nothing happened, one of the boldest swung himself up over the tow rope onto the deck. He was followed by the others, and they advanced cautiously, with drawn knives and pistols. Not a soul was to be seen, and the men who were brave enough before a charging whale trembled with fear. The wheel and the lookout were alike deserted, and no sign of life could be discovered anywhere below. In the galley were the embers of a dead fire, and the table in the captain's cabin was spread out ready for a meal which had never been eaten. On deck everything was spick and span, and not the slightest evidence of a storm or any other disturbance could be found. The theory of a derelict was impossible. Apparently all had been well on board, and they had been sailing with good weather, when, without any warning, her crew had been suddenly snatched away by some dread power. The sailors with one accord agreed that it was the work of a sea serpent, but the mate had no place for the ordinary superstitions of the sea, and he still scoured the hold, expecting at any minute to encounter a dead body or some other evil evidence of foul play. Nothing more, however, was found, and the mate at length had to end his search with the unsatisfactory conclusion that the St. Clair, a brigantine registered from Hartpool, with cargo of lime, had been abandoned on the high seas for no apparent reason. Her skipper had taken with him the ship's papers and had not left a single clue behind. A crew was told off to stand by the St. Clair to bring her into port, and the others climbed into the longboat to row back to the whaler. "Just see if there is a name on that there dinghy before we go," said the mate. An exclamation of horror broke from one of the men as he read on the bow of the dinghy the name, Kanawha. The faces of all went white with a dire alarm as the facts of the mystery suddenly flashed before them. The Kanawha was the ship in which Captain Mogul Mackenzie had made himself notorious as a privateersman. Every one had heard her awe-inspiring name, and every Yankee seafaring man prayed that he might never meet her on the seas. After the Alabama was sunk and the Tallahassee was withdrawn, the Kanawha still remained to threaten the shipping of the North. For a long time her whereabouts had been unknown, and then she was discovered by a Federal gunboat, which gave chase and fired upon her. Without returning fire, she raced in for shelter amongst the dangerous islands off Cape Sable, and was lost in the fog. Rumor had it that she ran on the rocks off that perilous coast, and sank with all on board. As time went by, and there was no more sign of the corsair, the rumor was accepted as proven. Men began to spin yarns in the forecastle about Mogul Mackenzie, with an interest that was tinged with its former fear. Skippers were beginning to feel at ease again on the grim waters, when suddenly, like a bolt from the blue, came the awful news of the discovery of the St. Clair. Gunboats put off to scour the coastline, and again with fear and trembling, the lookout began to eye suspiciously every new sail coming up on the horizon. One afternoon, toward the end of May, a schooner came tearing into Portland Harbor with all her canvas crowded on and flying distress signals. Her skipper said that off the island of Campobello he had seen a long gray sailing ship with auxiliary power sweeping down upon him. As the wind was blowing strong inshore, he had taken to his heels and made for Portland. He was chased all the way, and his pursuer did not drop him until he was just off the harbor bar. Many doubted his story, however, saying that no one would dare to chase a peaceful craft so near to a great port in broad daylight. And again it was urged that an auxiliary vessel could easily have overhauled the schooner between Campobello and Portland. The fact that the captain of the schooner was as often drunk as sober, and that when he was under the influence of drink he was given to seeing visions, was pointed to as conclusive proof that his yarn was a lie. After the New Bedford whaler came into port with the abandoned St. Clair, it was known beyond doubt that the Kanawha was a real menace, but nobody cared to admit that Mogul Mackenzie was as bold as the schooner's report would imply, and hence countless arguments were put forward to allay such fears. But a few days later the fact that the pirates were still haunting their coast was absolutely corroborated. A coastal packet from Boston arrived at Yarmouth with the news that she had not only sighted Kanawha in the distance, but they had crossed each other's paths so near that the name could be discerned beyond question with a spyglass. She was heading up the Bay of Fundy and did not pause or pay any heed to the other ship. This news brought with it consternation, and every town and village along the Fundy was now ahum with stories and theories about the pirate ship. The interest, instead of being abated, was augmented as the days went by with no further report. In the public houses and along the quays, it was almost the only topic of conversation. The excitement became almost feverish when it was known that several captains, outward bound, had taken with them a supply of rifles and ammunition. The prospect of a fight seemed imminent. About a week after the adventure of the Boston packet, Her Majesty's ship Buzzard appeared off Yarmouth Harbor. The news of the Kanawha had come to the admiral at Halifax, and he had dispatched the warship to cruise about the troubled coast. "That'll be the end of old Mogul Mackenzie, now that he's got an English ship on his trail," averred a Canadian as he sat drinking in the Yarmouth Light with a group of seafaring men of various nationalities. "It takes the British jack-tar to put the kibosh on this pirate game. One of them is worth a shipload of Yankees at the business." "Well, don't you crow too loud now," replied a Boston skipper. "I reckon that Nova Scotian booze artist who ran into Portland the other day, scared of his shadow, would not do you fellows much credit." "Yes, but what about your gunboats that have had the job of fixing the Kanawha for the last 3 years and haven't done it yet?" The feelings between Canada and the United States were none too good just after the Civil War, and the Canadian was bound not to lose this opportunity for horseplay. "You're a fine crowd of sea dogs, you are, you fellas from the Boston Tea Party. 3 years after one little half-drowned rat, and haven't got him yet. Wouldn't Sir Francis Drake or Lord Nelson be proud of the record that you long-legged, slab-sided Yankees have made on the sea?" "Shut your mouth, you blue-nosed, down-east herring choker!" roared the Yankee skipper. "I reckon we've given you traitors that tried to stab us in the back a good enough licking. And if any more of your dirty dogs ever come nosing about down south of Mason and Dixon's line, I'll bet they'll soon find out what our record is." "Well, you fools can waste your tongue and wind," said a third man, raising his glass. "But for me, here's good luck to the Buzzard." "So say we, all of us," chimed in the others, and the Yankee and the Canadian drank together to the success of the British ship, forgetting their petty jealousies before a common foe. Everywhere the news of the arrival of the British ship was hailed with delight. All seemed to agree that her presence assured the speedy extermination of the pirate crew. But after several days of futile cruising about the coast, her commander, to escape from a coming storm, had to put into St. Mary's Bay, with the object of his search still eluding his vigilance. He only arrived in time to hear the last chapter of the Kanawha's tale of horrors. The night before, Dominique Lefontaine, a farmer living alone at Météran, a little village on the French shore, had been awakened from his sleep by the moaning and wailing of a human voice. For days the imminent peril of an assault from the pirates had filled the people of the French coast with forebodings. And now, awakened thus in the dead of night, the lonely Frenchman was well nigh paralyzed with terror. With his flesh creeping and his eyes wide, he groped for his rifle, and waiting in the darkness, while ever and anon came those unearthly cries from the beach. Nearly an hour passed before he could gather himself together sufficiently to investigate the cause of the alarm. At last, when the piteous wailing had grown weak and intermittent, the instinct of humanity mastered his fears, and he went forth to give a possible succor to the one in need. On the beach, lying prostrate, with the water lapping about his feet, he found a man in the last stage of exhaustion. The blood was flowing from his mouth, and as Dominique turned him over to stanch its flow, he found that his tongue had been cut out, and hence the unearthly wailing which had roused him from his sleep. The beach was deserted by this time, and it was too dark to see far out into the bay. Dominique carried the unfortunate man to his house and nursed him there for many weeks. He survived his frightful experiences and lived on for 20 years, a pathetic and helpless figure, supported by the big-hearted farmers and fishermen of the French shore. Evidently he had known too much for his enemies, and they had sealed his mouth forever. He became known as the mysterious man of Météhan, and his deplorable condition was always pointed to as a mute witness of the last villainy of Mogul Mackenzie. On the night following the episode of the mysterious man of Météhan, a wild and untoward storm swept down the North Atlantic and over the seaboard far and near. In the Bay of Fundy that night, the elements met in their grandest extremes. Tide rips and mountain waves opposed each other with titanic force. All along the bleak and rock-ribbed coast, the boiling waters lay churned into foam. Over the breakwaters, the giant combers crashed and soared far up into the troubled sky, while out under the black clouds of the night, the whirlpools and the tempests met. Was ever a night like this before? Those on shore thanked God, and those with fathers on the sea gazed out upon a darkness where no star of hope could shine. Now and again through the Stygian gloom a torrent of sheet lightning rolled down across the heavens, bringing in its wake a moment of terrible light. It was in one of these brief moments of illumination that the wan watchers at Hall's Harbor discerned a long gray ship being swept like a spectre before the winds toward the Isle of Haut. Until the flash of lightning, the doomed seamen appeared to have been unconscious of their fast approaching fate, and then, as if suddenly awakened, they sent a long thin trail of light to wind itself far up into the darkness. Again and again the rockets shot upward from her bow, while above the noises of the tempest came the roar of a gun. The people on the shore looked at each other with blanched faces, speechless, helpless. A lifetime by that shore had taught them the utter puniness of the sons of men. Others would have tried to do something with what they thought was their strong arm, but the fishermen knew too well that the Fundy's arm was stronger. In silence they waited with bated breath while the awful moments passed. Imperturbable they stood there, with their feet in the white foam and their faces in the salt spray, and gazed at the curtain of the night, behind which a tragedy was passing, as dark and dire as any in the annals of the sea. Another flash of lightning, and there, dashing upon the iron rocks, was a great ship with all her sails set, and a cloud of lurid smoke trailing from her funnel. She was gray-colored with auxiliary power, and as her lines dawned upon those who saw her in the moment of light, they burst out with one accord, "It's the Kanawha! It's the Kanawha!" As if in answer to their sudden cry, another gun roared, and another shower of rockets shot up into the sky, and then all was lost again in the darkness and the voices of the tempest. Next morning the winds had gone out with the tide, and when in the afternoon the calm waters had risen, a boat put off from Hall's Harbor and rowed to the Isle of Haut. For several hours the rocky shores were searched for some traces of the wreck, but not a spar or splinter could be found. All about the bright waters laughed, with naught but the sunbeams on their bosom, and not a shadow remained from last night's sorrow on the sea. So Mogul Mackenzie, who had lived a life of stress, passed out on the wings of storm. In his end, as always, he baffled pursuit, and was sought, but could not be found. His sailings on the sea were in secret, and his last port in death was a mystery. But as has been already related, when the northern lights come down across the haunted island, the distress signals of his pirate crew are still seen shooting up into the night. Footnotes 27 from Blackwood's Magazine. End of 18. The Passing of Mogul Mackenzie. Recording by Patrick McAfee, Chicago. gis.depaul.edu/pmcAfee.